Welcome to Innovating Music, a podcast from the UCLA Herb Alpert School of Music and the UCLA Center for Music Innovation. I'm your host, Dr. Gigi Johnson. Ed Goldfarb is a charm. His current profession is being the heart and mind behind the music, behind Pokémon, where he has created motifs, threads of musical compositions and conversations around a cultural icon, but he also brings to it a really different way of looking at music. He will share how he uses technology and analog relationships to create music from his Northern California studio with a team, to work extensively on a broad variety of music and genres within a single type of experience. But he'll talk about his unique type of synesthesia and how playing music at a very young age and being able to play piano and other instruments behind live performance gave him this unique superpower, my phrase, not his, on how he looks at and embraces music along with multimedia and live experiences. He'll talk a bit about the great American middlebrow experience and how that drove his understanding and awareness of music about Beach Blanket Babylon and his years and years of working on that live show, but how that connects to working with digital audio workstations and his really interesting magic of connecting all these dots around creating music for Pokemon. So please enjoy this conversation with Ed.
I have kind of always heard music in my head, and since I've never spent any length of time in anyone else's head,
that would be weird all by itself.
Right, yeah. We all saw Being John Malkovich a couple of times, but beyond that, I haven't really done it, so the only assumption that I can draw is not everyone hears music in their head. And
now, do you hear it all the time?
I do hear it. I just hear it all the time. I'm hearing a score to our conversation right now. I'm even seeing it kind of written out a little bit in manuscript, which is something that's actually kind of crept in as my ear has developed. It's actually made me a tiny bit more insane in my mid 40s and early 50s.
Now, are you in part synesthetic?
Yes, very much so. Yeah.
Okay. I have several young friends who are synesthetic, and I have a little bit of synesthesia. Otherwise, I pay attention to it more. But the fact that we have music coming in as multiple sensory inputs is not as you're saying, you can't see in other people's heads to see what that is and an impact. But for you, it's kind of a music superpower.
I guess, yeah. And it's totally natural. And I have worked to develop it. But I was raised, my parents both came up in what I guess Alex Ross from the New Yorker, the classical music writer, called the Great American Middlebrow Experience or something like that, where like every kid in the New York public schools where my parents grew up, like knew all the major themes from the Beethoven symphonies. It's just something that they were taught as like you would learn your ABCs or math stuff. So I kind of grew up in that, and they both played piano. My dad worked his way through law school, leading Dixieland bands professionally. So there was music in the house. Like a lot of middle-class families, we had a piano, and I took lessons early, but I was banging out stuff on the piano, like listening to Sesame Street records and stuff like that before I started lessons. I think I started at the Yamaha Music School, was just starting in the United States at that point. It would have been the very early 70s. And I started those classes at, I guess, the age of 5. And I took to it. I dug it. I had to be kind of initially cajoled into playing, a half hour every day. And my mom would sit with me, and she says I was, really cool about it really early on. And as much as having a child myself, I'm like, really? I was just chill about it. I probably was, because even now playing, piano is a great source of comfort for me, and I'll come home from a gig where I played 3 hours, and I'll want to play. So I'm quite fortunate that way, and I do not take that for granted. Like with any artist, it takes a little leap to go from the stasis of dreaming about what you're going to work on and how marvelous it's going to be, and then actually jumping into actually working, and then, the disappointment. Nope, it's not that marvelous. Oh, well. I do have enough residual remembering of how much fun that is to create and play. So I don't have too much trouble working and getting into a working mode, which is quite fortunate, because it can be hard as an artist to actually get down to the process of creating.
So you come from a music as showing up in your head, music as practice, music as emotional, physical engagement.
Yeah.
How did you get further and deeper and broader into all of this?
I guess I started playing piano for people, like for my school choirs and stuff like that. In retrospect, really early, like in elementary school. I think I was accompanying, on occasion, like as a special thing, I was accompanying my 6th grade choir. Like, okay, here's one song, and little Edward Goldfarb is going to play piano for us. I can only imagine what that sounded like. But that was wonderful of the teachers, like, to give me the shot. I don't know whether, God help me, it was me who suggested that I help out or something like that. But that got me started performing, besides the usual piano recitals, which were horribly dramatic, and the less discussed, the better. But the working with groups, with like accompanying and stuff like that, that was sort of my ticket in initially as a young kid. And I actually became a professional at like 12 or 13. I wrote some rudimentary arrangements for my middle school theatrical production. Like, charts weren't available for a particular song, and I offered to write them, even though I had very little idea of what to do. And I started accompanying for a vocal teacher and playing at parties when I was 13.
So how did that end up with being a professional musician, and then going from that to everything you've done, including the current incarnation with Pokemon, where people may not think, how is music and the art of music and being, getting involved with composing for film, but how does that end up with Pokemon?
Oh,
You've
yeah.
had such a journey, right?
I had a very early realization as watching cartoons as a kid that the music in cartoons, especially in Bugs Bunny, the great scores that were put together by Carl Stalling and those other early geniuses working with stone tools and gaslights, I realized that what they did was really cool, and that kind of what they scored was the way I heard things in my head. And it's probably a chicken and egg thing, where experiencing those wonderful works of art at a very early age, just naturally, when I would see somebody slip on the street, I would hear boom, boom, because how else are you going to score that, and as I grew up hearing that stuff and was musically inclined, I think it made sense that doing that, making music for animation, and kind of like taking the stuff that I heard in my head anyway, and somehow making a living with that was kind of in the back of my mind. And from there, professionally, my musical journey is probably not. It's probably totally different, and also totally similar to a lot of other professional musicians who've had multi-decade careers without becoming famous, because I started out playing piano. That was my main instrument. I learned how to read music and did the usual kind of kid who knows music stuff, playing it on ensembles, learning a little about writing, to because keyboards were expensive still. As I went from junior high to high school, I got interested in playing guitar because I got interested in rock music and pop, and it was more inexpensive to get a decent sounding presenting guitar rig. Guitars were also much cooler than keyboards. This is like the late 70s, early 80s. So I started to pick up guitar. And of course, if you play guitar and you know something about music, you just need to think a little bit and then you can play bass. And as I was in bands and starting to have ideas, if
I'm
you
not
have
sure every bass player would agree on that, but yeah.
No, of course not. But there's a kind of thing, there's a kind of arrogance you get as a music producer too, where it's like, because you hear these things in your head, you think that you can do them yourself. And most producers don't get over that, Hopefully we just get the budget at some point to hire people who do things that sound as good as what we're hearing. And of course, there's always Pro Tools, or your other DAW. Nowadays, I do feel that we're more limited by what we hear in our heads than what we're capable of creating with our hands. Now, I think kind of the sky's the limit, and you don't have to be able to play at all. You just have to be able to hear. And I think it's harder to hear than it is to play, but that's probably another thing. Anyhow, so I'm in high school now, and I know just enough about the four main rock and roll instruments to be dangerous. The other inflammatory thing that I was going to say in my previous paragraph after the guitar and bass stuff was that because I was a person in a band, and I was both a trained musician and I had ideas, I wanted to tell the drummer what to do. So I learned enough about the kit to do that, and that was also the early years of drum programming and drum machines, and I was very excited about that. To be able to not deal with drum sets and the kludge of recording them, which was no small feat when you had the equipment of the late 70s, early 80s as a kid, a 4-track recorder or whatever. So now I'm getting out of high school into college. I was actually interested in medicine. I was kind of an overachiever in high school, in that I had good grades and kind of academic scholarship stuff. But my parents pushed me into music. My dad was a musician growing up, in post-war Brooklyn, and really wanted to be a professional musician, and was kind of just sort of pushed into the law profession by his parents. And he didn't want to see the same thing happen to me. So he's like, you're gifted at music. You've already been a professional musician for several years. You should just pursue that. And so I did. So I got a music degree at Cal Berkeley, and graduated in 1988.
Well, can you share with us, if someone looks you up on IMDb, the thing that kind of jumps out is how the heck did this kid end up with the music department of Apocalypse Now?
I kind of made the arrogant decision that I wasn't going to go to Los Angeles, that I was going to stay in the Bay Area. And a lot of it was just kind of personal sort of, fears, knowing what I knew about my personality. I was concerned I'd wind up dead in a ditch by the end of my 20s in Los Angeles, and that it was kind of better for me to stay out of what I perceived to be the belly of the beast of the industry, and see what I could do in the San Francisco Bay Area, because it's where I had spent the grand majority of my life. It's where I felt at home. I already had a bunch of contacts, not people who were doing, international or even nationally recognized stuff, but there was enough of a kind of just regional music business at that point where I was already helping people with demos and playing on records and doing all different kinds of live performances in a bunch of different musical, but other than that, unrelated disciplines. So I felt like there was a pretty good thing going. So I stuck around. A friend of mine that I had gone to Hebrew school with calls me maybe 6 months after I'm out of college and just doing my demo studio thing, playing at a church, music directing for children's musical theater groups, kind of doing anything that came down the pike musically. Because I both had the sort of personality where something came in that I hadn't done before, I'd say, oh, sure, I can do that. And then I'd figure out how. And I also had some rock and roll skills, and I had some theater skills, and I could lead singers or instrumentalists from behind a keyboard, and I could write arrangements. I could do all these things. I certainly wasn't the best at any of them, but I had that kind of decathlon thing where, unless it was like playing lead guitar in a metal band, I could probably do whatever it was. So 6 months after school, after I get out of college, this guy, Jeff Saltzman, calls me and says, "Hey, Ed, remember me? Went to Hebrew school. I used to, after Hebrew school stuff, I would run into him occasionally at Tower Records, because he worked there. And that was high school. But he called me and said, I got this recording contract. And it was a wonderful story. I digress, but Jeff is one of those guys who made cassettes in his bedroom and handed them off to friends, and friends would pass them around to other friends, and eventually a friend knew someone at a record company, came back to Jeff, said, "Hey, we love what you're doing. We want to give you money and have you make records for us." And he said, I got this cool gig at Tower Records right now, and I'm just really not into it. Just one of these amazing stories. But anyhow, they eventually convinced him to do it. And he called me because he remembered me as the guy who seemed to know what he was doing about that kind of stuff. We ended up putting together a studio. He had this brilliant idea to use his advance to buy a 16-track recorder, tape recorder, because that's what was around, and a mixing board. And we set it up in my nice apartment, and we split the time that we used it. He worked on his record. I worked on my stuff. And in those kind of 3 years that we shared that space, we both just learned a ton about making records, and I scored a couple of short films, and we just had a really great period of growth and learning. Out of the blue, a friend of mine said, "Hey, I've got this gig up at Beach Blanket Babylon in San Francisco, this theater show. There is an opportunity. They're looking for a music director." Having really, again, just making this crazy left turn after working on studio stuff, for 3 or 4 years, which is an eternity when you're in your early 20s. I answered the call for Beach Blanket Babylon, and I got that job. I was a little young in retrospect. I was 24 when I was hired. The way the gig was structured, I was managing people in the band who were quite a bit older than me, and theoretically I had to sort of manage the singers and performers as well, and that wasn't a great dynamic, but artistically it was huge. It had run from 1974 continuously, so it was the longest running musical theater production of any kind in the world, and I was music director there from 1991 to 2002. Arguably at its commercial peak, it had played 8 shows a week in North Beach and San Francisco, and it was sold out every show, for years. But it was a satirical review based on pop culture and politics, and it changed constantly. It changed based on what was going on in the world. So we would write musical numbers on Monday, and they would be put into the show on Wednesday based on something culturally that had happened the previous Friday. So it was a great way to learn all kinds of musical and theatrical and technical disciplines, and it was a great way to meet any artist or celebrity who passed through San Francisco or who lived in San Francisco, including Francis Ford Coppola, who has been a Bay Area resident, I think, but he lives other places too, but he's been a Bay Area resident primarily since the 1970s, and he was friendly with the people who wrote and managed Beach Blanket Babylon, and we were introduced, and he and I hit it off, and I've been working with him and his family ever since.
You have done so much. You have, but it's been a random walk, but a not random walk, that you have taken your expertise and grown it. You've done stuff in film and TV and ads, games, and live performances, soundtracks. How in the world did you get to what you're now doing? And I want to talk about kind of the world of creation and technology in Pokemon.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I did at Beach Blanket Babylon in this 90-minute musical performance that happened 8 times a week. So how many, not including rehearsals, how many hours am I playing piano each week? Right. And one of the things that I would do, we had musical numbers in the course of the 90 minutes, but I also played underscore for dialogue that happened on the stage. And that would be fluid and dynamic, kind of based on what happened in the show. It was pretty carefully scripted, but it changed all the time. So I was always developing underscore and, improvising and creating in real time. So I did that show for more than a decade. So I built up all these improvisational, compositional chops. And in my spare time, when while I was at Beach Blanket, I was still running a studio and kind of eased my way into film. I had always had contacts in the world of advertising and short films and stuff. So I did a little bit of that. And then when I met the Coppola family and started doing stuff for American Zoetrope, I did more of that. And the experience that I had improvising underscore for Beach Blanket Babylon was huge. I really started to be able to feel comfortable scoring, because it takes a while to kind of get the hang of it. And I would say that scoring for images, even though like scoring for animation is way different, comic animation is different than scoring for horror or drama. A lot of tenets are the same. These styles are more similar than they are different.
Let's teleport just to today. Today, you wake up,
right,
and you're working with a group of other people on short-term deadlines to take images from an international superstar brand for all ages,
yeah,
and need to create almost an emotional translation. What is it that you actually do? What tech do you use? What people do you use? And what timelines do you have to work on? How do you make this orchestra of engagement happen for something that is bringing an asset that's been around for a long time and making it fresh and engageable? Maybe that's overly leading the witness here, but
assuming that all that stuff that you say is true, not the technical stuff, but like the creative achievements.
Yeah.
Assuming that that's true, well, what do I do? Well, we do Pokemon, the series has been broadcast internationally I'm in the 22nd season. As I'm doing this interview, that season is going to conclude. That season has run in the United States more or less from January 2019 to January 2020. There's upwards of 50 episodes in this season, and that's a Japanese anime tradition in that there's one episode a week and there are no breaks. I don't know what the what laws can concerning working hours are in Japan, but I know it can be a hard order. That's a lot of shows. But as I work on what's called a dub, in that there's a version of the show that happens in Japan, and then I'm working on what's called the dub, the international version, meaning that the languages that you're going to hear it in are dubbed. They're other than the original. I think mine it's heard in it's like I don't know the exact figures. It's like 110 countries and like 17 different languages or something. So, but I get episodes, and I get the sound effects and Japanese dialogue, and then I kind of just look at the pictures and keep working until the music that's heard on the soundtrack is the music that I hear on my head or close to it. The concept of Pokemon roughly translates into pocket monsters, although we don't use that language with Pokemon in the United States. And there's almost 800 of 800 different Pokemon, which are fantastical creatures with all different kinds of attributes. One of my favorites is the camel with volcanoes for humps, but there's really all kinds, and the most famous is Pikachu, the adorable yellow electric mouse with the zigzag tail. The significant things that I do with the score is that there is I've created a little musical motif for each Pokemon that I've encountered in each Pokemon that factors significantly in the score of the episodes that I've worked on so far. I have given them a theme. So I have a database of more than 300 of these motifs that I've created, which it's coincidental that I've done about 300 episodes of the show, maybe 300, 310. And the motif count may be a little lower, maybe a little higher. So that means I've addressed a bit less than half of the Pokemon that exist. And so that's one of the primary artistic things that I do in my score. Technically, I use Pro Tools. I'm pretty sure I'm in a distinct minority of composers who use MIDI and virtual instruments and use Pro Tools. But there's nothing that I want to do that I can't do with Pro Tools MIDI. My assistants use stuff like Logic and Ableton, and I'm fluent with those. But I just love Pro Tools for the ease of use for working with audio, and it's just the DAW that I know the best. And although it seems like a lot of people are much more comfortable jumping ship from or using multiple DAWs than when I started out, it still does feel that like they're like religions, that you pick one early and you just kind of stick with it. And if it disappoints, it has to really disappoint you in order for you to jump ship.
But then is it jump ship or adding things to it? And then you're working with other people that are in their own digital religious experiences of working that they work with. I mean, so how are you kind of integrating? Because you're saying that you're adding people. You have so much going on with this.
Right.
What does a current TV show music production studio look like in the current era? I mean, you've got the ability to hear things in your head and translate things both into traditional acoustic as well as digital.
Right.
How do you work with other people with all that, and how's the pace go? How does that all work?
Oh, well, the show, the Pokemon show, the release of the anime series coincides with the release of the game. So there's kind of a reboot of the anime every 3 years, because there's a new Pokemon handheld game released every 3 years. So I'm going to be starting my third 3-year cycle, my 7th year as the composer for the show, in 2020. and we reboot. We don't create new motifs for Pokemon that we've already done so, because that would be insane. And one of the things that we're looking for is continuity, so that these motifs occur episode over episode and season after season. So we don't change the motifs, but we do get new Pokemon when we start a new 3-year arc, and we also get a new region. The show, the action of the show takes place in a new area, and again, this mirrors the game. So we create a new sonic language, a new orchestrational palette for each of the 3 years. So that involves a lot of composing for an initial period every 3 years, and that period can be anywhere from 3 months to 6 months, where we're frantically creating new content. Over the 3 years, 150 episodes, give or take, of the show, we'll create a library of cues, and we will reuse a lot of cues. So over the 3 years, the work gets slightly less intense, although we are always, scoring new stuff for each episode. At the beginning, the scores are all new. There's no library. We're starting from scratch, except for the motifs, which are musical information rather than sonic information.
I want to pause you there and ask the question: who is we?
Oh, who is we? Well, it depends. It's always me. It's always my assistant and co-composer, Akhil Gopal, who I met through the Berkeley School of Music referral service when I started working on Pokemon. I contacted a composer friend, great composer and guitarist named Lyle Workman, and said, I got this gig, what do I do? And he's like, okay, well, you're going to need someone working for you, and et cetera, et cetera. And he talked me through it. And I was very fortunate to find Akhil. He had been out of school, I think, less than a year, already a super gifted orchestrator and composer. And he has been working with me and has been my employee for every minute that I've been working on Pokemon. So that's been wonderful. And beyond that, we have a rotating series of interns and helpers who will remain nameless simply because we're kind of between them right now. But I'm ramping up, and I'll probably, at the most, I'll have 5 people working with me to varying degrees.
And at various locations, because you're still in NorCal, yes?
Oh yeah, I'm in Northern California. Akhil is in Southern California and has always been in Southern California. And whoever works with me can kind of be anywhere. We just have we have mirror systems. Like I use specific software instruments for my strings and horns and synths and stuff like that, and specific reverb settings. But it's really easy for us to emulate the same audio. But that's important because there are several of us. There can be several different composers on a show, on a given show, and it needs to be sonically compatible. You don't always hear sonic compatibility when you listen to a score, especially in an animated score. It can be pretty piecemeal. But I like to go for consistency. I will say that we're kind of used to, especially nowadays, with a score being a combination of stuff that sounds orchestral and stuff that sounds electronic and pop songs and that kind of thing. But I try to keep things vibrant and unique, and with the awareness that they might be watching these shows in 100 years, and they're definitely going to be watching them in 20 years. So I don't want anything that sounds too much like today, whatever that means.
So you've got your deep history of growing up with music. You have years and years of producing for live stage and being in that moment, as well as all your work in film, TV, and games coming to inform an interesting, unique production environment.
Yes.
Where do you think this stuff for you will be going, and what do you have to next kind of create and innovate for yourself?
Well, it's funny because this is doing what I do is very, very close to my dream job. It's I'm not famous, but I'm busy. I'm not rich, but I'm not complaining. I get to do just about any kind of music genre wise that I'd like to. My work week to week and moment to moment is dictated by what happens on the screen. But what happens on the screen in this particular show is so wide ranging and eclectic and inventive that I really feel creatively satisfied by what I do with the show. Scoring, and also a thing that we haven't talked about is I get to compose and produce songs, and have them get disseminated all over the world. Not necessarily the way across the way broad-based appeal pop music is, but it's usually like the theme song for the weekly series, or a song that's heard at the beginning or end of one of the movies that we do each year. And that's real. I love making pop music. There's a certain kind of knack that you have to have for it that I will be honing my entire life. But the songs that I produce are well received, and I have great fun making them. And it's a wonderful kind of adjunct and alternative to working on the score. So it's a really cool gig. And when people ask what would, what do you still want to do, and it's like, well, I'd love to work with the Star Wars franchise, because it meant a lot to me just as a human growing up. And also John Williams' scores and his stuff in general speaks to me at a higher level than most other composition to picture. Just the melodicism and the attention to detail. There have been other things that I've heard, but no one really does it for me in this particular milieu the way John Williams does. So it would be cool to follow in his footsteps. I suppose I could do that doing a disaster movie, since that was the other thing he did in the 70s. And I suppose I'm doing it anyway now, just by the nature of doing what I'm doing. So other than that, I've never had a business plan. There's this wonderful line from the magician comedian Penn Jillette that he says about the comedian Gilbert Gottfried, that you couldn't run a dry cleaners with Gilbert's business sense, and you really couldn't run a dry cleaners with my business sense either. But just the fact that I guess remained interested in music and what's going on, and that I still have that I've never lost my love for it. If anything, it's become greater. I'm kind of at this point, the gentle forces that guide me and the way that I interact with them have not steered me too far, and I think I'm just gonna kind of follow that dynamic through and see what happens.
And let's plan to do a follow-up conversation
Absolutely.
here and have you, because in many ways you have such a great deep dive and really different lens on some of this. But for now, if people would like to get a hold of you, how could they reach out? How would you like to be reached out to?
You can check out some of my work at edgoldfarbmusic.com. Pokémon is on Netflix. My work starts with season 17. And yeah, so there should be 6 seasons of it on Netflix, or maybe it's just season 20 through 22 now. I forget. Some things go on, things go off. And I'm also, Pokemon is also on Disney XD. And actually, when you hear this, it will be Disney Plus. So we'll be there too, and on Netflix. and edgoldfarbmusic.com. And, you can email me if you want to talk to me about what I do, or even more interestingly, about what you do, at madcaplabs@comcast.net. That's me.
Great, Ed. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, that wraps up this podcast. Many thanks to the UCLA Herb Alpert School of Music and the UCLA Center for Music Innovation for being our hosts of this ongoing series. You can subscribe to us in all the usual places, or you can come find us at innovation.schoolofmusic.ucla.edu. Join us again to follow the other adventures that we will be tracking down in innovating music. Thanks again.